Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're worshiping, in your home or on your TV, laptop or phone, you are a part of this family. And you could watch or listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists, search for past messages, and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to the Cornerstone America's podcast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoy the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family.
Let's just continue the fun this morning. So there were some psychiatric patients some years ago. 3 of them I want to mention: Leon, Joseph, and Clyde. What's interesting about these 3 patients is they all had the same disorder, the same problem. They all thought they were God. Now, it had one medical worker, psychologist, psychiatrist that was working with these 3 men, counseling them individually, trying to help them with their thoughts of grandeur or who they thought they were. Was not getting anywhere individually, so he decided to have a group counseling session or sessions. Very interesting. Never seen or heard of a messianic group counseling session, but they had that, and became very interesting as they were working through this in the comments and questions that were asked. Like one man would say, "I'm Jesus Christ, I'm the Son of God, and I'm on a mission to save the world." And the other man would say, "How do you know you're Jesus Christ?" And the first man would say, "Well, God told me." And the second man would respond, "I never told you any such thing." And these are the kind of conversations that they had. But ever since time began, or soon after time began, that with our original parents, Adam and Eve, we've had a problem. People have had a problem, very similar to Leon and Joseph and Clyde, that we tend to think more of ourselves than we are. Like Winston Churchill said, "We're all worms, but I do believe that I'm a glowworm." We tend to think of ourselves at times better than what we are. Our country has become very overconfident. It's like we've got self-esteem on steroids that has caused problems. For example, they've done some surveys and gotten feedback from people, and so we're overconfident as a country. 94% of college professors believe that they have above average teaching skills. 94%. A survey of high school students found that 70% of them think that they have above average leadership skills. Only 2% think that they have below average leadership skills. Are you guys with me this morning? Americans, we tend to think of ourselves being really, really good at math. Some of us know we're not good at math. We can't really do math anymore above a 5th grader, but that's my problem, not yours. But a lot of Americans think that they're really, really good at math and they're really not good at math. Interesting, in the 1950s, 12% of high school seniors thought they were very important. Only 12% in 1950 among high school seniors thought they were very important. In the 1990s, 80% of high school seniors thought they were very important. And that has gone up even higher to today. And Jesus' followers had the same problem at the Last Supper, the night that Jesus would be betrayed, and then he would be crucified after that. His disciples were arguing about who was the greatest. I mean, they had the same problem. They had this dispute. And does anybody doubt that we live in a society where people tend to self-promote themselves? There's no doubt that we live in an age of self-promotion. And it happens all the time. And I think social media has bled into this or fed into it and just gives us more avenues to do this in. So, before 2010, nobody really knew what humble brag is. Does everybody know what a humble brag is? Are you guys on social media at all? I mean, does anybody know? So a humble brag is when you're bragging about something, but you try and hide it with a complaint about something. And it happens all the time on social media, especially among those that are really popular or famous celebrities. So and we didn't know this term until about 2010 when it really hit hard and it was accepted into the English lexicon and it became a word, humble brag. So let me give you some examples of a humble brag this morning. And if you just go to Twitter, you'll find humble brags all over the place. It's there. So how about this? Man, this is so unfair. Why didn't the Lamborghini dealership not tell me that I would get pulled over at least once a week for driving this car? It's time to get a Corolla, LOL. Humble brag. I'm driving a Lambo. So, he didn't tell me I was going to get pulled over, How about this? I did something very selfless, but more importantly, it was genuine, and I know it meant a lot to the person in the long run. So worth it. How about this one? I can't believe I tripped in front of the paparazzi again. So embarrassing. Pretends to lament over an awkward situation, but really trying to draw attention. Hey, I'm so important, the paparazzi follows me around. Humble brag. How about this one? A supermodel tweeted this one. I'm featured in People's Most Beautiful. What can I say? They all make mistakes. But I did the shoot with no makeup on. Scary. Setting up your own charity event is no joke. Would have thought it would be easier. This is so hard. I'm so annoyed. My diamond earrings keep clanging against my AirPods when I'm running. I'm sorry, take them off. How about this one? Traveling first class is so exhausting. Traveling first class, come on, give me a break. All right, how about this one? This is a pastor. It's not me. I'm not on Twitter or X. Okay. I'm truly humbled you follow my tweets. I pray they enrich your life and strengthen your ministry. God bless all 200,000 of you. What is that? Humble brag. Humble brag, okay? All right, so we live in a society that promotes the self-promotion. And this has been a problem all along since Adam and Eve sinned throughout the years. And like I said, Jesus' disciples buying into it too, fighting, arguing about who is the greatest among them. But going back to the 4 songs that Isaiah wrote that prophesied about the Messiah 700 years before he would come, talks about the servant of the Lord. And there's 4 chapters in which they occur, chapter 42, 49, 50, and then the last one in 52 into 53. These were the first Christmas songs that were written. I believe the first one was written 700 years before Jesus came. And the one we're going to talk about today is not just about the servant of the Lord, but it's the suffering servant of the Lord. And what the prophets of old could not understand is that the Messiah that they had been waiting on, had been praying for, and wanted to come, would come in such a way to be a servant and to the point of suffering that they couldn't understand it. They couldn't get a grasp on it. And they were wondering, and they were praying, and they were thinking, and they were trying to figure this out. And we get a glimpse of this in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. It says in verse 10, concerning this salvation, the prophets who spoke of the grace that was to come to you searched intently and with the greatest care. Notice in verse 11, trying to find out the time and the circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted, notice here, predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that would follow. They had troubles understanding the sufferings that these prophets were talking about, and yet at the same time talking about the glories that he would have. And they couldn't figure out how they went together. Even the prophets that gave these prophecies still wondering, what would this look like? What does this mean? When will this happen? And what they were showing, what they were prophesying about before Jesus came, 700 years before he came, that this Messiah would be unlike any other. That the first Christmas songs were telling a story about the Messiah, that he would be a leader that is different than all others, that he wouldn't self-promote, he wouldn't oppress others, that he would truly bring freedom and bring liberty. And we think about the scriptures in the New Testament, this theme runs strong. You think about Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. If you're familiar with the text, it talks about how Jesus emptied himself out and became a man and obedient to the point of death, humble and suffering. Revelation talks about the Lamb who was slain, talks about humility and suffering. And for Christians, this is our example that Jesus leads this way. So let's talk about this 4th song that Isaiah wrote, the one where he really focuses on the suffering servant, written 700 years before Jesus. And the prophets and the people of Isaiah's day could not figure out how would this come to pass. And you'll see as we go through here, it just mimics Jesus' life. written so many years ahead. So let's jump into our text this morning. My first point is the marred king amazes. We're talking about the promised king this morning. We're talking about the suffering king this morning. This text talks about how he amazed those. Verse 13 of Isaiah 52, he says, "See, my servant will act wisely and will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted." He said, look closely, pay attention to what's going to happen. Because my servant's going to act wisely, man. He's going to completely fulfill what the Father wants him to do. He's the Messiah. He's going to do everything. He knows what he needs to do, and he's going to do it. He's going to act wisely to bring about the desired results that God wants. And it says that he will be raised up. And here's the progression of terms that he's talking about, that he'll be raised, he'll be lifted up, and then highly exalted. And I think what he's referring to here is being raised, being resurrected from the dead, and then being lifted up, ascending into heaven, and then highly exalted, being seated at the right hand of the Father. All written before Jesus ever did this. In verse 14, he says, just as there were many who were appalled at him. Now we start to see the tone of this start to change. We see this Messiah that's going to rule, that's going to reign, that's going to be highly exalted. And then it says, just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond what any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. And he starts to change the tone of this prophetic word and giving insight to the suffering that Jesus would go through, being beat and then crucified. And they would be appalled at him, thinking, what kind of leader, what kind of Messiah could this be that would suffer this way? This is not the way we pictured it. We figured he'd come as a leader, as a military leader. He would take charge and oppress the bad guys and lift up the good guys. But they were appalled at this, especially the Jews of Jesus' day were appalled at this. They couldn't understand this. And that his appearance, that he would be disfigured, that he would be beaten, that he would be crucified. People who had that were criminals, were cursed of God, and yet marred beyond any human likeness by the beating that he went through. But talking about physically, and I don't know, maybe even talking about spiritually, how sin, all the sin of the world coming on him, marred him. You go back and read Psalm 22, another psalm about Jesus, his death and resurrection. Again, have the same idea of the torture and the stuff that he went through hundreds of years before he came. Isaiah even said it like this in chapter 50, verse 6. He said, I offered my back to those who beat me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Another prophecy about Jesus. And Jesus foretold what he would go through. Matthew 16:21, before it ever happened. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day, and on the third day be raised to life. Verse 15, back to Isaiah 52, verse 15, says, he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. It's interesting, there's a little bit of controversy over this word sprinkle. Should this word really be translated as sprinkle? Like maybe it's meaning that he's sprinkling his blood over the nations for salvation, for the payment for their sin. If you go to my next slide, some believe it should be translated startle, which I think makes more sense in this context. The NIV translates it the other way as sprinkle, but the New Living Translation translates it as startle. And look at this, it says, and he will startle many nations, that the kings will stand speechless in his presence once they understand what he's done for them. It's like they're appalled at what he went through, the beating and the suffering, but they're also shocked or startled by what the actual meaning of that is. For they will see what they have not been told, and they will see and understand what they have not heard. The marred one astonishes and amazes the nations through his suffering, that he was marred, he was disfigured so that he could pay the price for us. Number two, the rejected king redeems. Here's what we see as we continue through this text, that the rejected king redeems. Isaiah 53 verse 1, he says, who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? We're going from this astonishing or amazed, and now we're being moved to he's rejected. Who has believed our message? As the prophets are giving this message about the Messiah, the coming Messiah, that he's rejected. The arm of the Lord having the idea of the strength. This is one who will come with God's strength. In verse 2, he says, he grew up before him like a tender shoot from the root of David, and like a root out of dry ground. This becomes interesting, a root out of dry ground. Like dry ground is hard to grow things in dry ground. So it's like he had unseemingly success. This guy you would look at him and say, he just looks like the average person. You wouldn't recognize him as a Messiah. Nothing would draw you to him. He was a root out of dry ground. Thinking he would be successful, he might be the most likely to not succeed out of this group. If you're looking at a bunch of people and you might say, I don't think he's gonna make it. He was a root out of dry ground. There was no promise of him becoming anything. I mean, think about the parents that he came from. I mean, he was born out of wedlock. I mean, he was poor, born into a poor family. I mean, his first cradle was a manger, was a feeding trough. I mean, he had nothing going for him. He was rejected. Nothing drew you to him. Why was he rejected? Look at verse 3. He says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. He was rejected probably because of the pain that he went through. They couldn't see the Messiah going through that. Like one from whom people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Man, they rejected him. They didn't even want to look at him. They didn't want to see what he was going through. You ever hide your face for something? You don't even want to see it. You don't want to give it your attention. You don't even want to know that it's happening. He was rejected. His own people rejected him. His own followers rejected him. He was rejected, but he was rejected so that we could be accepted. Number 3, the pierced king brings peace. We see this again in Isaiah here. Verse 4, he says, surely who took up our pain and he bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. Now look at this. I love the way the prophet is getting into this. He says, surely he took up our pain and he bore our suffering. This is what he was doing. But what everybody was thinking was this. They considered him punished by God. The Jews at large, as they're watching Jesus go through all that he was going through, figured, you know what's happening? This is God punishing him because he is blaspheming. This is God punishing him because he's not the Messiah. This is God punishing him for doing wrong. This is the way the religious leaders and the Jews at Jesus' time, most of them saw this happening. What he was doing, taking up our pain, bearing our suffering, paying the price for us. But yet they were thinking as they were watching this, yeah, God's punishing him for this. This is what's really happening. In verse 5, he says, but he was pierced for our transgressions. Again, the prophet's driving home this point. It was for us that he did this. You see, this is what Christmas is all about. This is what we know. This is what we celebrate. That he was pierced for our transgressions, that he was crushed for our iniquities, that the punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed, that by his stripes we are healed. And that word healed, peace, shalom, means a whole, complete wholeness, a wellness, spirit, soul, and body. This is what Jesus went through as he was rejected. But when he was rejected, this is what he was going through. He was doing it all for us. Jesus is the king who suffers not for his sins, but for our sins. Verse 6, he says, we are all like sheep that have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We've all fallen short. Again, this was written 700 years before Jesus actually did this. Let's keep going. The silent king saves. As he went through all of this, he remained silent. Verse 7, he was oppressed. He was afflicted, and yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And all that he went through, as they oppressed him, as they beat him, as they mistreated him, and in a way that afflicted, doing it with to humble him, to humiliate him. He went through it all and did not open his mouth. Bring in the lamb here, like a lamb led to the slaughter, and a sheep before its shearers is silent. He did not open his mouth. He was oppressed, he was arrested, he was abused, he was humiliated, he was mistreated. Verse 8. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. Yet who of this generation protested? Of those that were there, who protested? Who said, don't do this? By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. Yet who of this generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living, meaning he died. For the transgression of my people, he was punished. You could imagine reading the 700 years before Jesus came, figuring out, what does this mean? How is this going to happen? I think hindsight's 2020. We can look back and put the pieces together and understand it, but leading up to this was nowhere in the mind of the Jews that he would suffer like this and what he had to go through. Verse 9, he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. Now, I love this verse especially. I find it so interesting. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, meaning he was crucified with criminals, right? One on the left, one on the right. But yet it didn't stop there. And with the rich in his death, he was put into a rich man's tomb. Now, the interesting thing becomes, what do they do with criminals after they've crucified them and they're dead? They throw them on the trash heap where they're burned. That's where Jesus' body should have gone. But because there was a wealthy Jewish man that said, hey, I want to lay him in my tomb, a wealthy Jewish man. If you read John's gospel, it says he was a secret Christian. He was a secret follower of Jesus. He tried not to let too many people know that he takes his body and he lays him in his tomb. If it wasn't for what he did, we would not have an empty tomb as evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. His body should have been on a trash heap on fire. Interesting, knowing what would happen in the moments, or as part of his death, 700 years before it actually happened, he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. I think also given the indication he may have died with criminals, but he was not a criminal. He died with criminals, but he was not a criminal. And he makes this point, he says, though he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. He had done nothing wrong. Let's keep going in our text. Verse 10. Talking about the suffering king secures victory. As we come to our last three verses in this text, he says, yet it is the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer. Here's what's interesting. Getting to this point now, we find out why he was crucified, why he went through the suffering, why he was put to death. Notice, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in the land. This becomes interesting too because it's the Lord's will. And you think about, how could God want his son to go through this? And the reason is because he knew what the outcome would be. That in his crushing and causing him to suffer, though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, and that's what he did, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Meaning he would act wisely and bring about the desired result that God wanted. Salvation for all that would place their faith and trust in Jesus. He says, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Isaiah was writing this long before it ever happened. See, the servant of the Lord didn't come to tell people what God wants. Rather, he came to be what God wants. Isaiah 53 verse 11 says, and he has suffered, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. This would be the result of Jesus' coming. That after he suffered, he would see the light of life and be satisfied. And by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. In verse 12. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. This last verse, therefore, summing it up, what has happened, what Jesus has done for us. Again, explaining it 700 years before it would happen. This is what Jesus did for us, as the prophets stated it beforehand. And then Jesus, no way for him to cause all the events of his life to line up to fulfill this, but all of them falling into place as God designed so that he could pour out his life so that we could come into relationship and fellowship with him, so that we could be saved, to have our past wiped away, to have him help us with our present, and to secure our future with him. This is what Christmas is all about. And this is what the early Christmas songs, as Isaiah was writing them, they couldn't see it. They couldn't get a hold of it, but we get to see it. We get to experience it. We get to walk in it. Will you stand with me this morning as we get ready to close in prayer? Here's something we need to think about: is Jesus is the King who conquers by laying down his life. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. This is what we celebrate at Easter, that Jesus laid down his life, and by doing it, he conquered sin and death on our behalf. Let me close with this story. During World War II, in a German concentration camp, there were a group of prisoners that were lined up for execution. That one of the Jews had tried to escape, and because of that, the Germans were going to execute 10 Jews. And so they picked out the 10 and they lined them up and were getting ready to kill them. And one of the 10 started pleading for his life. And he said, please don't kill me. I've got a wife, I've got kids. They depend on me, they need me, don't kill me. And one of the other Jews that was not chosen to be executed offered himself in this man's place. And they switched places. This man died by lethal injection with the other 9, bringing the total to 10 when he wasn't chosen for death. So this other man could live. And he did live. He made it out of the concentration camp, got back with his family, and continued to tell the story of how this man had given his life for him. And I think that's a great example of what Jesus has done for us. That we're the ones that should be executed. We're the ones that are guilty. And he was innocent. And he came to earth to live the life that we couldn't, to take our place and take on our sin, our mistakes, when he didn't have to. And he did it silently, I think partly showing his willingness to do it so that we could have new life, so that we could have the relationship with Jesus that we now have today. And I think, as Matt was saying at the beginning, that we should go out and tell others about what Jesus has done for us.